Hello, welcome to Post Colonial Space. I'm Masood Raja, and today we'll continue our conversation about Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed. In today's conversation, I'll cover from page 79, middle of the page, to page 81. Now, if you've watched my previous video on this, we are already almost concluding his discussion of the banking system of education, and he's now moving on to explaining what he means by problem-posing educational system. There are quite a few technical terms that he uses here, and I will try to explain them. But roughly, the plan is to read from page 71, middle of the page, to top of page 81. So here, let's go through the first set of reading, and then I'll come and talk to you about it. Those truly committed to liberation must reject the banking concept in its entirety, adopting instead a concept of women and men as conscious beings and consciousness as consciousness intent upon the world. They must abandon the educational goal of deposit making and replace it with the posing of the problems of human beings in their relations with the world. Problem-posing education, responding to the essence of consciousness, intentionality, rejects communiques and embodies communication. It epitomizes the speech characteristics of consciousness, being conscious of not only as intent on objects, but as turned in upon itself in a Jasperian split, consciousness as consciousness of consciousness. Liberating education consists in acts of cognition, not transferals of information. It is a learning situation in which the cognizable object, far from being the end of cognitive act, intermediates the cognitive actors, teacher on the one hand and students on the other. Accordingly, the practice of problem-posing education entails at the outset that the teacher-student contradiction be resolved. Dialogical relations, indispensable to the capacity of cognitive actors to cooperate in perceiving the same cognizable object, are otherwise impossible. Indeed, problem-posing education, which breaks with the vertical pattern characteristic of banking education, can fulfill its function as the practice of freedom only if it can overcome the above contradiction. Through dialogue, the teacher of the students and students of the teachers cease to exist, and a new term emerges, teacher-student with student-teachers. The teacher is no longer merely the one who teaches, but one who is himself taught in the dialogue with students, who in turn, while being taught, also teach. They become jointly responsible for a process in which all grow. In this process, arguments based on authority are no longer valid. In order to function, authority must be on the side of freedom, not against it. Here, no one teaches another, nor is anyone self-taught. People teach each other, mediated by the world, by the cognizable objects which in banking education are owned by the teacher. Okay, so there is a lot to unpack here. Now remember, he has already given us a thorough understanding of the banking system of education, and now he's moving into describing what he means by the problem-posing education. And while at places he will just focus on the problem-posing education, but it will pretty much always in one way or the other be in reference to the banking system of education. So what we learn in these first line is, first of all, what our true commitment ought to be. There can't be half measures. The true commitment to the problem-posing education is a complete renunciation of the banking system of education. That's the first condition, right? And then he tells us that the problem-posing education focuses on the very essence of human consciousness. And that, in his words, is intentionality, right? And it comes from phenomenology, right? But also from Karl Jasper, whom he quotes, the idea that we are all intending subjects, right? And that thought is intending outwards to seek, but not just its objects, right? It must understand things outside of itself. It becomes Jasperian when thought or the person thinking is conscious of the process of thinking itself, because the thought goes out and then comes back to you, and that's where reflection is born. Now, there's a slight shift here, okay, from the Cartesian thought, right? No, so the Cartesian split of mind and body was that thought must go inwards to seek the I, right? Here, the thought is outward tending, which is phenomenology, but what is at the crux of that intentionality is knowing, being consciousness of one's own consciousness. And that is something, what he says, is what problem-posing education must focus on, because he's going somewhere with that. Then he's going to the question of cognition versus transferal, right? So cognition, even if you understand it like through its dictionary meaning, is recognition, understanding something, right? Logically, in your mind, understanding something. Because it appeals to the cognitive abilities. We are all thinking beings. And if thought is outward tending, problem-posing education then focuses on cognition and not transferal, right? A transferal, we have already learned in the banking system of education, is when knowledge is transferred from the teacher to the students, and all the student needs to do in that kind of transferal is to internalize that knowledge and reproduce it. But when understanding and cognition is important, when student is acknowledged as a cognitive being and not as a passive recipient, then the knowledge that is shared collectively, right? Talked about collectively. And there is a dialogic relationship, there is a give and take. And because of that, one of the consequences of that is that dynamic, right, teachers of students and students of teacher that he talks about shifts, right? And it becomes teacher-student and student-teacher, which acknowledges at the very basis of that practice that the teacher can learn from the students too, and the students have something to teach to the students, right? So what kind of pedagogy would emerge out of it? A pedagogy that does not internalize this idea that I am a teacher, hence I have the right to treat my students as objects, and I am the fount of all knowledge. And all the students need to do is listen to me and reproduce what I tell them. Now, I talked about it in other lectures too, and I will link it to my brief video on these paternalistic modes of teaching that Mark Bracker talks about. And in that vocabulary, we call it the discourse of the master, right? And what is the discourse of the master? In which the teacher expects that he or she has all the knowledge and can carry the persona of a teacherly person, and the sole job of the students is to replicate the master, to perform like the master does, to learn things that the master knows, and hence that becomes the learning process. And that Freire, of course, would be absolutely opposed to. Now, where he concludes this is that in this process, arguments based on authority are no longer valid. You can't walk into a class and say, you must accept what I'm saying because I'm your teacher. No. The validity of any object that you are studying along with the students, a cognizable object that can be understood logically, the validity of problem-posing education is that the students must have a say in deciding it, right? what it is, how to approach it. 2, and whatever you present in a class or bring about or discuss with your students as co-learners must be on the side of the freedom. It must not try to teach in a way that concretizes or solidifies the hierarchies that already exist. Now remember, the reason he's insisting on it is because he has already taught us about the hierarchical system, right, as it is established. And if the teacher maintains that relationship, right, then no matter how revolutionary the subject matter, that hierarchy, that frame of top and bottom, teacher and student, would constantly be invoked in a process of teaching, right? And then it would solidify that. So that is what, and hence the last words of this paragraph. Cognizable objects which in banking education are owned by the teacher. Cognizable objects, any object of study which can be understood, which can be discussed, which can be broken apart, must become also the property of students so that they can collectively study them, whatever you are studying, and not remain the property of the teacher who must pass them down to the students. So this is, the beginning of theoretically explaining now the problem-posing system of education in opposition to the banking system that he has already explained at length. Let's go and read a little more, and then I'll come and talk about it. Banking concept, with its tendency to dichotomize everything, distinguishes 2 stages in the action of the educator. During the first, he cognizes a cognizable object while he prepares his lessons in his study or his laboratory. During the second, he expounds to his students about that object. The students are not called upon to know but to memorize the contents narrated by the teacher, nor do the students practice any act of cognition, since the object towards which that act should be directed is the property of the teacher rather than a medium evoking the critical reflection of both teacher and students. Hence, in the name of the preservation of culture and knowledge, we have a system which achieves neither true knowledge nor true culture. The problem-posing method does not dichotomize the activity of the teacher-student. She is not cognitive at one point and narrative at another. She is always cognitive, whether preparing a project or engaging in dialogue with the students. He does not regard cognizable objects as his private property, but as the object of reflection by himself and the students. In this way, the problem-posing educator constantly reforms his reflections in the reflection of the students. The students, no longer docile listeners, are now critical co-investigators in dialogue with the teacher. The teacher presents the material to the students for their consideration and reconsiders her earlier considerations as the students express their own. The role of the problem-posing educator is to create, together with the students, the conditions under which knowledge at the level of the doxa is superseded by true knowledge at the level of the logos. So we are still on the cognizable object, right? What is that? I mean, in a teacher-student relationship in the banking system, the cognizable object is the knowledge, right, which the teacher is supposed to transfer to the students. There are 2 stages that he talks about. We all do that. When you say, I'm preparing for my fall courses, as a teacher, what you are saying is, I'm gathering materials, doing my research, preparing a syllabus, right? That's the first stage. You are learning the object of study. The second assumption is that when the semester starts, I will now take this object of study, which is my property, and transfer it to the students. So in the first stage, we create the object of study, the cognizable object. It can be a scientific research, culture, whatever. And in the second stage, we transfer it. Throughout this process, that transferal is our responsibility, and it is our property, that knowledge. The student has no say in how it will be transferred or even the right to question it. They are just supposed to master it, right? And that's where that interesting phrase comes in, preservation of culture and knowledge. We have a system which achieves neither true knowledge nor true culture. For example, think of it, how many times as a professor or a teacher you have thought, if you're a humanities professor, your argument is we preserve culture by teaching great works of art and literature, right? And if you're a social sciences professor, your job is to produce knowledge, to preserve it, and to pass it on to the next generation. But if the students are not actively involved in it, then the culture is not really being transferred. They are just memorizing what you teach them and reproducing it. At best, they are trying to learn what you want them to learn and reproduce it. They're not becoming cultured in the process, or the culture is not being preserved. Same with the knowledge, right? So these two stages, the teacher prepares the cognizable object, which is knowledge or whatever they want to teach, and then transfers it. That's the banking system. In the problem-posing system, this dichotomy doesn't exist, this dichotomy between the teacher-student or the knowledge that is cognizable, right, and then transferred. No, it doesn't remain that you first share the knowledge. It is cognitive, which involves thinking, and then certainly becomes also narrative, where you tell the story and the students reproduce it. It has to be constantly cognitive knowledge. That means that in the cognitive process, in the process of understanding, the mental faculties of the student are engaged in the process itself, in questioning the materials shared, and they learn through asking questions, and you learn from their questions and maybe reformulate your method of teaching, because the students are no longer docile listeners. They are participants in their own education. That's the subtle difference. How do we do it in our classes? If you look at the vocabularies of the university system itself, I'm talking about the US universities, it's all based in the banking model, right? Right now we are, in the midst of a pandemic, so all energies are on delivery. Here are the means. This is how you can deliver your content. There are content management systems that we use. Nowhere in there is a question as to how to make this delivery a reciprocal process, right? In which we don't pass on our property to the students to reproduce what we have taught them. So like in my classes, I offer my knowledge, but I always offer it as tentative, and I encourage my students within the system in which we exist to constantly have their opinions, to challenge my assertions, and to teach me about how they see the same thing differently and why. And in the process, I've learned that every time I teach the same text, when my students get engaged with it, they teach me new things. Same with this medium, right? Ironic it is that I'm using the banking system to teach. I've already mentioned that. But, for example, when you put in comments, right, a question or something that came to your mind, what does it do? It teaches me. It becomes a reciprocal process where I say, oh, I talked about this, but this is a new idea. That is what he's talking about. But that it constantly must remain so and may not just become a narrative strategy. That's his point. And then the last paragraph, the role of the problem-posing educator is to create, together with the students, the conditions under which knowledge at the level of the doxa is superseded by true knowledge at the level of logos. So the distinction between doxa and logos, which is also a dichotomous relationship. Doxa usually is a belief system. Anything that you believe in religiously or otherwise, unquestionably, right? And it's not based in reason, it's based in belief, right? So anything that is offered or proffered to a student as the truth, unquestionable, unimpeachable, that's doxa. Now the debate comes from Parmenides and others. I'm not going to that, you can look it up. Logos, on the other hand, is the question of knowledge, knowing through inquiry, right? Through discussion, through cognition, right? So the problem posing education then is about cognition, about problem posing, about collectively solving a problem, and not referring to a doxa, this is how it is, right, or this is how it ought to be, but rather, here is something, here are my thoughts on it, right? Now tell me, what do you think? What can you teach me? So that transition from doxa, from just offering things that are concrete, unchangeable, immutable, and passing them down, to a relationship in which the teacher-student dichotomy doesn't exist, and this dichotomy between the narrative transference and cognitive engagement with knowledge also doesn't exist. And learning becomes a process of co-learning, thinking together about any object of study, right? These are some of my thoughts on these pages. We have covered from page 79 to the first two main paragraphs on page 81. I will come back and try to conclude this chapter, but this is a very important chapter, so we'll give it its time. Meanwhile, as always, if you have any questions, please do post them. Send them my way and I'll try to answer them. And to make it really a dialogic process, I would love to see your comments. And, I'll leave you with a question. What do you think, knowing all this by Freire, right, as students, scholars, people who live on this planet, how do you think it can help us in small ways or large ways to change our own behaviors, right? But then to change the world around us, transform it through praxis. Any ideas would be more than welcome. Thank you, and I will see you next time. And as always, peace and love.